Welcome to Transcendent. I'm Joe, and I'm the dad.
And I'm Raya, and I'm the daughter.
Well, we haven't seen each other for a little while. You know, I just came back from the trip of a lifetime.
Yeah, how did it go?
I'll never do that again.
The story says it was Thanksgiving, first one I'd attended in years since coming out. I wasn't out to everyone around the table, but I was to enough of them for the air to feel tight with unspoken things. There was this moment right after my aunt made one of those casually cruel jokes, you know the type, masked as humor, but laced with ignorance. She laughed, and a few others nervously followed, and I just sat there. I didn't respond. I didn't flinch. I didn't educate. I didn't defend. I just looked at her, gently, steady, silent. And the room shifted. The laughter died quickly, not because I yelled, not because I explained, but because I didn't. My silence said, I heard that, I felt that, and I will not diminish myself just to keep the peace. And you know, later on, my cousin pulled me aside and said, thank you for not saying anything. That spoke volumes. Turned out she'd been wrestling with her own identity, and then seeing someone else refuse to perform or pacify gave her the courage that she didn't know that she needed. That was the day I learned that silence can be a full sentence, a boundary, a mirror, a message. Sometimes saying nothing is exactly what needs to be said.
I just can't say anything about that. Actually, I can. As you know, I was on a board of a big complex, a nursing home and an assisted living facility and an independent living facility. As part of the board, we talk about policies and things that boards normally talk about. At one of the meetings, what was on the agenda was being more welcoming and accepting and affirming of those clients, which is what we call them rather than patients. Mm-hmm. Those clients who were coming in need to know that we were fully affirming and fully accepting. And I figured out that there was probably 2 people that were very much against this. And I wasn't sure about the other 7. But I figured this is probably going to pass. But we have those 2 that are going to really argue this. So when it came up, one of them immediately just talked about all the reasons why we shouldn't be moving in this direction, why this wasn't the right idea. Went on for at least 10 minutes, giving us all the reasons and all the things that we should stay away from this. It's controversial, et cetera, et cetera. When she was done, nobody said a thing. The second person, who I pegged as another one that was against it, just stood up. He didn't say one word. He just stood up. And they just looked at him, and he just stood there and didn't say a thing. Finally, the president said, do you have something you want to add? And he said, I don't agree with any of this that she said. And he sat down. But his 30 seconds of standing there saying nothing said volumes. Wow. It was really powerful, and everybody looked at him. We took a vote, and it passed 8-1.
Wow.
Yeah.
We're talking today about silence as a tool to use in conversations. You might call it the sounds of silence. Hello,
well,
darkness, my old friend.
Right.
We talked about a lot of tools on this podcast that you can use in conversations, difficult conversations, to de-escalate and to bring things down, or to help be more persuasive when people are not seeing eye to eye on LGBTQ issues. This is one more tool that we want to give you that you can put in your toolkit. Just like if you're doing work somewhere, you've got your hammer and you've got your pliers and you've got your wrench and you pull out whatever the right tool is for the circumstance. Silence is another tool that you can use.
One of the reasons we want to bring this up is that it's something you can always use. It's something that when you're not sure what you can say, you can use silence. You can use it in so many ways. Sometimes you might be backed in a corner and don't know what to say. We're going to tell you how to use silence as that tool. One of the first ways, of course, that we can do is you can create a dead space that will bring down anything if there was, for example, an argument or a potential argument and it's starting to fester. Silence can break that. Silence in itself can put the burden back where it belongs, on the speaker who was trying to escalate something. And it allows people to reflect on what was just said.
It's a way of saying that wasn't okay. I'm not going to dignify it with a response. Like I read in our story that started off the podcast. It can be difficult to know sometimes, and you feel like I've got to have the right response or I've got to say the witty thing. But sometimes just refusing to engage in the argument itself, but to make it clear that you're there and you're present, but you're not going to dignify it with a response can be one of the most helpful things that you can do.
You can use silence right after making a point or asking a question. You put silence in there and it emphasizes it. You can't say an exclamation point. You can say something loud and get to that point as though it's exclamation point. But believe it or not, you could do the same thing with silence.
And it's not necessarily even after the point that you've just made. In fact, it oftentimes works best when you ask a question and the person responds and then you let their answer sit for a little bit. You give them some space. I learned this from a man named Anthony Magnabosco, who goes out and he does something called street epistemology. He will go out into open areas. He's in Texas, so he can go out in warmer times, not up where I live, where it's cold for half of the year. But he'll go out and he'll talk to people and he will ask them about some of their beliefs. And they can choose what their beliefs are. But then he'll ask them questions about, now, if somebody else that believed differently from you said that same thing on the opposite side, but they said it, what would make that different? And then they'll think for a little bit and then they might respond. And anytime he feels like they've made a really profound statement that they need to sit with and think about, he'll just be quiet for a little bit and let that pause give them time to consider this profound statement that they just said.
We say silence here isn't absence, it's presence. It says, what you just said, that deserves a moment.
Yes.
That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. They call that in a play, they call that a beat. You give it a beat.
Yeah.
Give it that moment to let it sink in.
Well, I could give it if you don't want to give it a beat, you could give it a rutabaga.
Another time you want to use silence is when words would escalate rather than clarify.
Yes.
Oh, it's so often, especially on the internet. Somebody will say something and you just, I don't know how you are, but I know I just feel like I've got to get in there. There's that classic cartoon where the guy is sitting at his computer and he says, I can't come to bed right now, honey. Somebody is wrong on the internet.
I never respond to those. Never. All I put on there is one-liners. So if you're out there and you happen to have friended me on Facebook, you'll realize all I put on is one-liners.
Do you have a few of those? Actually, if you want to see the one-liners that we have here on the podcast, follow Dad on Facebook because you'll see them come out.
Yes, you will.
But that happens in lots of places. And you are very good about this. I feel like you have modeled this for me in many situations where it's the classic statement. If you don't have something nice to say, then don't say anything at all.
We've been planning our topics for the year. We're planning on doing a complete episode with testimonials from people on coming out. These are stories that people want to hear. They are some of our most popular. We'd like to hear from you, whether it's a difficult situation or it's a positive situation. Tell us your story. We might select yours to be one of the ones that we use in the future.
If you're interested in being part of that, you can email transcendent@gmail.com and let us know what your story is. It might be a coming out story. It might be an ally story about how you learned to be a better ally. It might even be something you got listening to this podcast. If you have the capability, you could even record an MP3. Send us the MP3 directly or send us a link to that. Or if you don't know how to do that, just send us an email and I'll help you through that. Include your name, email, and phone number, and we'll get back to you because you have something to share with others. You know, I had a situation at work the other day. My work computer was acting up. You know how it is when your web page won't come up and nothing's loading properly and everything is wrong and the database that said one thing and then I went over to the other place and it wasn't there and just everything. I was so frustrated. And I said, may I put you on hold for a moment? And the person said, sure. And I put them on hold. And then I typed into my group chat, I can't believe that none of my work tools here are, working. And none of this is doing what it's supposed to do. And I let that in a safe place where there were other agents that understood how things are. I vented to them so that then I could come back to my person and say, everything is good. Yeah, okay, we're all set here. So I didn't make them feel like, oh, everything is terrible. I didn't take my negativity and push that onto them. I instead found a healthy way to go and take that somewhere else so I could come back and be a voice of positivity to them in what I was doing. And I would hope that we would all try to do that.
We do that also. We use that silence sometimes in our interviews that we have. When we have a guest on our podcast, sometimes silence can prompt the guest to keep talking. And in doing so, tell a whole lot more than they intended to tell. And that works a lot. Instead of following your agenda, they're talking about something. We had Father Greg on. He at one point talked about how difficult it was for him, and we didn't respond. We didn't say anything. We just let it be silent for a minute. And then he moved into talking about how he had sat in a window in a second story and considered jumping out, considered suicide because of his concern about coming out. And that would have never happened if we wouldn't have put that silence in there and said nothing. He had to continue to talk. Probably went somewhere where he wasn't certain he was going to go. And those things can really matter a lot. So when you let others speak, they reveal more, and it's very helpful rather than interrupting them, as I often do to you.
You and I both have lots of things that we like to say. And so we have to remind ourselves that there's sometimes where it's not our turn to talk, where it's just time for that other person. And we want to be cognizant of that. The best thing that I have learned in my job, I'm on the phones all day with people. And I have discovered that the more I talk and tell them things, the less I understand about how they really want or what they really want. But when I stop and say, tell me about what you're looking for, the more I can make sure that I'm meeting their real needs and not just what I think their needs should be.
Yes. That's the same thing in all sales. All sales says the sale really happens when you listen, not when you talk. When you get to the point where they tell you the real reason that they're concerned about this and they don't want to buy it or whatever. That's when you can make the sale, when you find out the real reason.
If you're selling something, let's say you're selling widgets, and you go into the widget store and you say, hey, I'm selling you all these widgets so that you can sell these in your widget store, and I got this great price for you, and it's going to be, they're actually costing a little more than your existing widgets, but they're way better quality, and your people are going to like them a whole lot more, and we've gone through all the things. I've listened to you, and I've given you all the points. What do you think? Do you want to move forward? Are you ready to go with it today? And then what do? Don't talk.
Yeah.
You just sit there and let them think. Let them decide, because they have to weigh it in their minds. And that's exactly the same when we're having these difficult conversations about LGBTQ issues. When you do make that point, you stop and don't talk. Let them weigh it in their minds. Let it go over. And then when they're ready, they say, okay.
And silence can also be an act of resistance. So when you choose not to explain yourself or defend your identity or respond to ignorance is often more powerful than any rebuttal when you give it silence. And that's what happens. You get to the point where you wanted to respond to their ignorance, but you're not getting anywhere. Silence matters. What people do a lot is when you present them with something that they cannot refute. The cop pulls somebody over for speeding. He says, oh, you're speeding? What people want to do, instead of not saying anything at all, they want to try to deflect that whole issue to something else. Well, wait a minute. You want to arrest me for speeding? What about that guy back there that I passed that was jaywalking? The point is, you're getting into something that you want to try to elevate a debate that has nothing to do with the issue at hand. Well, rather than doing that, just silence alone can make everything much, much more palatable for both sides.
When you're in a conversation with somebody and you can tell this is not a good faith conversation, they're not really open to learning or to discussing or to having their opinions change, one of the most authentic ways to engage with them is by saying, you know what, actually, I think maybe we're done with this conversation. I'm not going to engage anymore. And I've had people in that situation that, well, and one more thing. You may have heard our episode a few weeks ago where we talked about spiritual abuse. And I talked about the person on the internet or an old friend of mine that was throwing things at me about how much in sin I am. Mm-hmm. He came back to me recently with some other things, and I just didn't respond. Because that's not going to go anywhere. We've had our conversation. I've already told him everything that there is to do. Now, I'm going to make it clear that I will be in relationship with him. I'm not rejecting him as a friend, but I'm not going to discuss LGBTQ issues anymore with him because it's not a good faith conversation any longer, and I know that.
I think we've all had this experience. We had to go to a funeral, and you walk in, and the grieving person is there. Sometimes they want to talk, and they want to visit with you a little bit. That's fine. But other times, you might come up to them, and all you can see is the grief. Mm-hmm. You walk up, and you're thinking to yourself, what do I say? I think the most powerful thing you can do is just walk up to them, hold their hand, and just be there. Just be there. That says more than any words you could say. And if you said any words when you left, they would have already forgotten those. But they would remember that you were there. That is a really great example of how silence can really help share in the grief, help show that you really care, that you want to be there. It actually could be much more powerful than coming up and saying something that is just something to fill the dead air.
Or worse yet, trying to fix things, trying to make things okay, trying to put a good spin on it.
Yeah.
They say that almost always you are better off to not say anything than to try to say something and have it be the wrong thing.
Yes.
When somebody is going through grief, when things are difficult, you can say, I'm sorry for your loss. I'm here. Don't say things like, well, they're in a better place now. If the grieving person says that, we can be there and we can stand in that place with them. But there are plenty of people that come from a different value set or just are not sure what they think or in a different place. And those words in that moment where they're feeling hurt and empty and missing their loved one, rather than bringing comfort, those words can ring hollow and just feel empty. But when we stand there in silence and in love, ironically, we would feel like that would be the empty thing to do. And it ends up that is the most value and the most love and the most care that we can bring to that conversation is by not forcing a conversation.
The same as with what we started with. In the story I told where the man just stood at our board meeting and said nothing. That was quite a visual. He just stood there and said nothing until the president said, do you have something to say? And he said, I don't agree with any of this. And he sat down. He didn't argue it or anything else, but his silence, his 30 seconds of standing there was dramatic. The message we are trying to bring to you is that at any time you could be caught in or backed into a corner, or you're involved in a conversation that's escalating, you want to make sure that you could diffuse that some way. And it's that magic word, silence.
There's times where if it's just a short amount of silence in the conversation, that's all that you need to do. Or like the president's time for his speech. There are times where the silence that is required is a longer silence. And in those times, if you're going to have a good faith relationship, I would encourage you to make sure that the person that you're speaking with knows that you are saying, I've said all that I have to say, as I told my friend. I don't have anything more to say, and I think we're done with this conversation now. Or there's times where maybe you're in a relationship and the argument has gotten so heated and you say, I think right now I need to take a moment and step away. I need to cool down. Let's regroup in about a half an hour. After we've had some time, I'm going to go take a walk or whatever we need to do. Figure out how much time you need that silence for. It's really important that you communicate your intentions, because otherwise it can be perceived as stonewalling, where you're not doing it in good faith. You're doing it to wall yourself off. You're not talking any longer, and that can end up really tearing apart the conversation and tearing apart the relationship. That's not what we want. We want to preserve relationships. We want to keep things strong. And when silence is a tool to keep a healthy relationship, that's great. We don't ever want to turn around and use silence as a weapon against those that we love the most.
And that's why you're not going to get silence from us next week.
That's right.
We're going to just keep preserving this relationship that we have with you. And in fact, we would like to invite you to ask others to listen to this as well. We have so many people listening to us from countries all over the world now. I believe we have people in every continent listening to us except Antarctica.
Well, we need our very first one. So if you want to go to Antarctica and become our first listener, that would be terrific.
You know what the problem is? I don't think they think we're cool.
We're grateful to have you coming back here week after week and checking us out. And with that,
we'll see you Monday.